Hello everyone, Michael Jones here from Michael Jones Custom Knives. Welcome to my forge today. In today's video, I've got a special project that I've been working on for the last couple of weeks. About a week ago, the new movie Dune 2, the sequel to the 2021 hit Dune, was released in theaters. And prior to its release, watching the previews, and then after going and seeing the movie, they've introduced a new character from the series, Feyd Rautha. And Feyd uses some pretty cool looking combat daggers in the movie. So I started looking at those daggers and thought it would be pretty cool if I could replicate those. So prior to the movie coming out, I started working on developing my own replicas of these combat daggers. And after seeing the movie, I think I've come pretty close to replicating what those look like. So to make these daggers, I'll be using a pair of leaf springs. And a little history about these leaf springs. These leaf springs came out of a World War II Jeep back from the 40s. This was used around on my grandpa's farm, and my dad, around 1960, got the axle and springs out of the old Jeep and made a trailer that he used to use to haul his carpentry equipment around. And then later we used that same trailer on the farm to haul junk, haul rocks, and do various work around the farm. Well, that trailer is long gone, been rotted away for many years, and the last time I was home, I was able to get the springs off the old axle and bring those back with me. So that's what I'll be using as the steel to make my replicas of these combat daggers. So I hope you enjoy the video, and as always, if you like what you see, please come back and look out for future videos, and please subscribe.
To get started on this build, the first thing I need to do is to break the springs apart. So I put a cutting wheel on my angle grinder, and I'm cutting the bands on each end that are helping to hold the springs together. Then I move to the center bolt and release that tension by cutting the bolt head off. And when these things break apart, you can see that they're pretty full of dirt. These have been laying out in a pasture for about 30 years, so they're pretty rusted up and pretty pitted. Now that I got the springs cut up, it's time to fire up my large forge and get the pieces in under heat so they can start annealing and so that I can start straightening them out. I got some help from my son to help hold the spring on the anvil while I started to straighten out the roll on the end of the spring. This was a little hard to hold by myself, so I needed an extra set of hands. After several cycles in the forge to heat and cool both pieces of steel and then straightening them both in the vise, I now had two pieces ready to start making both of the combat daggers. Since I'm making 2 daggers, I'll have to repeat each step of the process twice. But in order for this video not to become too long, I may not show every step in the process for both daggers. Time to drill the holes for the pins for the handle scales, and so that I can marry the 2 daggers together so I can shape the handles so that they match perfectly. So now that I've got the holes drilled in the shorter dagger for the knife scales, I'm using it as a pattern to drill the holes in the longer dagger. Once I'm done, I'll put pins in both daggers to put them together and take them over to my belt grinder and grind out the handles so that they match exactly. Now that the handles for both daggers are profiled, I'm drilling the holes for the smaller pins that will go in the back of the daggers to hold the back part of the scales. Now that I'm done profiling both daggers, it's on to the surface grinder to get them both flat and ready for the next step. Here I'm laying out the markings so that I can cut the grooves into the spine. If I'd have been thinking ahead, I should have pre-drilled these off of the pattern. That way when I ground the profile, I could have just ground down and got the profile exactly where I wanted it, and I would not have to hand cut all of these grooves. That'll be a lesson learned for next time. Now that I'm done surface grinding both daggers flat, it's time to take my layout die and mark the center line on both blades so I can grind in the bevels. Since I have two blades to work on, this is going to take a while to grind the bevels in on my belt grinder. The longer dagger was a little more difficult to grind in the bevels. I had to add an extension onto my tool rest on my belt grinder so that I had enough room to slide the dagger back and forth to grind in the bevels. Now it's time to hand sand both of the blades. This is the most time intensive and manual part of the process. Since there's two blades to work on, obviously it took twice as long to get these ready for the next step, which will be buffing and polishing. I'm using the daggers to drill out the holes for the knife scales so that they will match up perfectly. I'm using the same steel as I did to make the daggers. In the previews and on the photos that I've seen, the scales look pretty rough and pitted, almost utilitarian looking. And I think the steel that I'm using to make the daggers with the rust pits will match up pretty well and give the same appearance. Here I'm cutting out the handle scales for the long dagger. I did the same process for the shorter dagger earlier. The handle scales are all shaped and fitted. The blades are sanded and polished. Now it's time to move on to heat treatment. Since both daggers and the knife scales are made out of the same material, the daggers are starting to get out of balance. So to relieve some of that weight, I'm drilling out some of the excess steel from the knife scales and also from the knife handles to help balance them out and to make them a little bit lighter and easier to handle and to hold. Here I'm polishing and rebuffing both daggers one last time, getting them ready to put on my maker's mark, and then to move on to the next step, which is putting on the coating onto the knife blades. To make sure I don't make a mistake when I put on my maker's mark, I put the handle onto each side of each dagger and then trace around the front edge of the handle. This tells me exactly where I need to place my maker's mark and so that I don't make a mistake when I electrically etch it on. After applying my maker's mark, the next step is to apply a permanent coating to the daggers. From watching the movie previews and by seeing the movie, you can see that the smaller dagger is white and the larger one is black. So instead of using paint to coat these, which would easily scratch off, I decided to get some air cure Cerakote, which is a type of firearms protectant. It's a ceramic coating that you spray on and it air dries and cures in a few days. I thought this would be a good option and protect these knives really well. The instructions said that the air cure Cerakote would be dry to the touch in about an hour, and then partially cured after 24 hours. So I let the daggers hang overnight, and then the next morning I got up and started to sand away the beveled edges of the daggers before the ceramic got too hard. In the instructions, it said it would take up to 5 days to fully cure, but I did not want to wait too long because I know how tough this stuff can be once it sets up. Here I'm drilling some relief holes in the handles for the daggers. This will allow some space so that when I peen the pins on the anvil, they'll securely fasten the handles onto the sides of the daggers. One last pass on the wire brush to clean any remaining rust or debris off of the sides of the handles before I do the final assembly. I'm being very careful here attaching the handles to the daggers. The air cure Cerakote is still not fully cured, so if I hit the side with the hammer or hit the side of the knife up against the anvil, I could scratch it, and then I'd have to start all over with the Cerakote. The combat daggers are almost finished. The very last step is to prepare the leather wrappings to go around the handles. Here I'm cutting one of the leather straps, getting it ready to fit onto the white dagger. I'll do the same thing for the black one, and then once they're fitted, I'll permanently attach them to the daggers. Once the handles are wrapped in leather, the combat daggers are complete. Now just to remind you what Feyd Rautha's daggers look like from the preview, here's a screen capture. And now here's my take on the same combat daggers. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a lot of fun recreating the replicas of these combat daggers from Dune 2. As always, if you like what you see on my channel, please come back and look for future videos, and please don't forget to subscribe.